2018, and the topic that I have chosen to talk about is multiple voices, which is the single most commonly asked set of questions on the support forums on MuseScore.com. And of course, part of the reason it's extremely commonly asked is that people don't necessarily know what the term means, so they don't know what to look up in the manuals about it. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by multiple voices. What I mean by multiple voices is when you have more than one rhythm in the same measure. So if you have this, but then at the same time, I'm going to switch to voice 2, and now you can see how to actually enter this. Maybe there's half notes. So this is multiple voices in a nutshell. It's when you have one set of notes telling one story and another set of notes telling another story in the same measure. And it's a very common thing in vocal music. If you're writing for a 4-part choir, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, you'll have the soprano and alto parts on one staff, tenor and bass on another staff. At least that's one way of doing it. It's also very common in piano music because I have 5 fingers on my hand, and I can do that. I don't know if I'm actually set up by a piano today only because it was convenient to do that, but I play this. There we go. I'm kind of turned backwards. I don't know if you could actually see my hands doing that, but that's totally playable within one hand. I used fingers, one set of fingers for the top notes, and I used my thumb for the bottom notes. And guitar also, this is very common notation to have multiple things happening on one staff. So let me just go through in slow motion how I actually did that, and then we'll talk about all the other fun things you can do with multiple voices. So let me leave note input mode, and let me do this again. And this time I'll kind of really walk through what I'm doing. The notes with the stems up are voice 1. In MuseScore, each staff starts with voice 1, and then if you need additional voices, you can add them, voice 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to enter voice 1, and voice 1 is where notes are entered normally. So if I enter notes normally, these notes that I just entered, this is all voice 1. And you can tell this because the notes are highlighting in blue, the note input cursor is blue, and the blue voice 1 icon is highlighted over here. And if you notice, the stem directions they do the things that you are taught that stem directions are supposed to do normally. Stem directions are up if the note's on the bottom half of the staff, and they're down if the note's on the top half of the staff. And that's all well and good if there's only one voice in the measure. As soon as there's multiple voices, the rules change. And at that point, voice 1, the upper voice should have stems up, the lower voice should have stems down. So in MuseScore, voice 1 is going to be the only voice we use if there's one voice. If there's 2 voices, voice 1 is going to be the upper voice or the up stem voice. They might actually cross. The down stem voice might go higher than the up stem voice. I'll show that in a second. So I've now entered notes into this measure in voice 1. And I just used the cursor keys there. Actually, let me show you something I've been playing with, only because, I rebooted. It's not started yet. I've been using a script that will, a script that will display keystrokes as I press them. And I've been using that when doing demo videos that I'm recording. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyhow, I'll just tell you what I'm doing and try to use the toolbar as much as possible. So I've entered this set of notes into voice 1. If I now want to enter notes into voice 2, I switch to voice 2 using the toolbar here, and you'll see there's a shortcut, as there is for many things in MuseScore, Control, Alt, and the voice number. So I can either click the voice icon or use the shortcut Control, Alt, and then a number. Now you'll notice that the note input cursor has turned green, as has what's called the shadow note, the note that's following my mouse cursor to show me where notes would be entered. So if I enter an F now, it's going to enter in voice 2. And I can now enter a set of notes in voice 2. And so on. Now in this case, I have quarter notes in both voices. I didn't necessarily need to use separate voices for it. And if I was writing for piano, I almost certainly wouldn't do that. I should take that back. If I'm writing a fugue or a type of piece in which you're supposed to show the voices independently, I probably would do that, even if they have the same rhythm. But if you're writing a piece for voices, actual voices, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and that's your soprano and alto part, then actually it is pretty common to still show the stems separately, like that, up and down, even if the rhythms are the same. I say it's common, it's not ubiquitous. So depending on the style of the music and the editor and what else is going on, you might see them entering, if the rhythms are the same, you might see them enter this as chords. So notes that are on the same stem. And so just for contrast, I will do that here. I'll enter the F, oops, down an octave, an A, and then a G and C, and here I'm typing the letter names. I'm typing A and then Shift E, and then E, and then Shift D. I don't know why I picked those notes. Those are just the notes I happen to click. So you could enter notes this way if you want, if the rhythms are the same. But if the style of music is such that it's important to show the different voices, like a soprano and an alto part, or if this is a fugue for piano or guitar and you want to show the different voices happening, you would enter them in different voices. But the real power, of course, of multiple voices is when the rhythms are different. So let me enter those same first notes again. But now I'm going to go back and I'm going to use Control-Alt-2. And notice it just moves the cursor right to the beginning of the measure, because voice 2 you're going to enter left to right. So just like voice 1. So here, if maybe I wanted a couple of half notes, just an F and then a G. Well, that's how I do that. I typed 6 and then I typed F and G, and it entered those 2 half notes. You can also do this if you want the notes, say the notes are the same for part of the time, but well, it's easier to show you than to describe it. So let me just do that. Let me switch back to voice 1, and I'm going to enter that same series of notes again. Oops. Switch to quarter note. All right, now what if I really wanted this? And here again, I'm going to attempt to play it on the piano, and whether or not you can see it or not, that's probably very disorienting, but what the heck. So I just played, what if I really want this? So the first 2 notes were just single notes. Then I had 2 notes at a time with a different rhythm. That's something that happens pretty often in piano music. Let's look at how we might do that. So I'm going to go back here, or maybe, well, I'm just going to do that. I'm going to enter in another voice. So I'll switch to voice 2 and enter the A and then the C. And now in this voice, it's actually going to be a G, but it's an 8th note G. And then I had a quarter note B. So this is a pretty common situation in piano music as well as vocal music. The voices might be the same for part of the measure, but only different for part of it. So that's one way that you could notate that. You've probably, if you work with this kind of music much, though, you've probably seen that that's not the only way you might want to notate that sort of thing. Instead, what you might want to see is this. You want to see just the single notes where there's only single notes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to enter rests and then hide or delete them, and I'll talk about that. So I'm going to enter rests here, and then I'm going to enter just what I need in the second voice, which is the G and the A. And for this note here, yes, I could enter that B in the other voice. I don't really need to do that. I could switch to voice 1 to do that, but I'm going to enter it in voice 2 for now. Whoops. Oh, and I'm going to show you another shortcut. I accidentally still entered it as an 8th note. The shortcut W will take that note and lengthen it to the next longer duration. So W, and now it's a quarter note. Okay, so I now have something that's almost, but not quite, what I'm actually wanting. What I really want is to not see these rests. Well, you can't delete rests from voice 1 because voice 1 is the voice that really defines the structure of the measure and tells you where every beat is. But you are allowed to delete them in other voices. So I can, if I want, control-click these two and press delete. And now they're gone. You can still tell where the G comes in on beat 3 because it's aligned with this, and so it's okay to do that. The rules for when it's okay to delete rests in other voices are fairly complicated to get right. So when in doubt, it's harmless to leave the rests there. I'm actually, though, if I want to go back now and try to enter something else in that voice, I'm going to find that the fact that there's a hole there makes it difficult to enter. Like, I can't enter anything onto beat 2 right now because I've created this funny hole. I can go back to the beginning of the measure apparently and re-enter my A. Okay, so that works. But anyhow, I don't like those holes. Those holes can be, they can create problems down the road. So I prefer to I just press Control Z, got my rest back. If I'm deciding that I don't want to see those rests, what I will do is press V to hide them. And now they're grayed out on the screen and they won't print. I could, because there is 2 voices, this note is showing with the stem up, but I'm going to press X to flip it down so it looks more like a single voice. And then this beat then has the opposing stems because it's got different rhythms. This 4th beat has notes that are currently, I entered into different voices, but they don't have to be in different voices. So really, I could fix that. I'm going to take this note only and move it to voice 1 by just selecting it and pressing the voice 1 button. And now it's moved to voice 1. And then I can delete the rest. And again, here, stem direction-wise, I'm better off putting that stem down. So I'll press X. I see that there's a comment on the chat here. So the question here is there a musical difference between measures 6 and 7? Okay, these 2 here. And the answer is no, not really. I mean, the difference is, let's put it this way, if I were playing them on the piano, I would play them the same way. But if you were, say, there's different situations that could come up. If you're writing for piano and you're writing a fugue, which is actually the example that I had mentioned. If you're writing a fugue is meant to have independent parts, right? It's, you know, there might be one part that goes, right? And so the second voice came in a different hand. And if it's a 2-voice fugue, you can use the 2 separate staves for that. If it's a 3-voice fugue, though, at some point, one hand is playing 2 voices. And it's usually important to show the independence of the voices, to show each voice independently. And so we would use this approach there so that you can see more clearly that there's independent things. In fact, let me load up a fugue that I wrote so that you can see a little more about what that might look like. Because I've referred to fugues while I've been talking, I might as well show one. So here's a fugue in which, as you see, it's written is voice 1 here. It's mostly 16th notes. Now there's places where I'm actually showing, even though literally I would play this with 2 different hands, I wrote it on the same staff because I'm saving room for the fact that there is going to be a 3rd voice to enter. And now the top voice definitely needs separate stems. And it needs it because they're separate rhythms. But there might be other places, like here, you can see I have a series of 16th notes where they had the same rhythm. I could have chosen to write them in the same voice. I just didn't because it was more important to me to show the independence of the line. So I can see the bottom voice is ba-do-da-do-da-do-da-da-dum, and the top voice is bum ba boo bum bum ba boo bum bum bum. So there you go. That's the fugue aspect of it, imitative counterpoint. So that's what's going on there. Oops, I meant to go back to here. That's one reason why you might want to do this. So this might want to write things with opposing stems like that if it just feels important in the musical context. Or if you're writing a piece for a choir and this is the soprano and alto part, and everywhere else they've had separate stems because they've had different rhythms, maybe there's one measure where they just happen to have the same rhythm, but it's going to be confusing to just join them for that one measure. So you leave them separate. Now, if you're writing a hymn in which the rhythms are really the same almost everywhere, then it is pretty typical when writing that type of music to use same stems like this, or this type of writing where it's the same stem where possible and opposing stems where it's not possible. So when writing music that's largely homophonic, meaning largely all voices in the same rhythm, then you would typically use one voice where you could get away with it, two voices only where necessary. But if the texture is more polyphonic, then you would just use multiple voices everywhere. It makes it clearer. Another thing I want to show is in creating this measure. This measure here, I sort of manually combined the voices. I hid these rests and I moved this note to voice 1. There's actually a tool that this is one of the beautiful things about open source, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to re-enter that measure the original way. And then the other thing, I had voice 2, I had a quarter rest, a rest, and then this. All right, so here I have that measure as it was originally entered. When I was I still am working on MuseScore code. I mean, I do bug fixes and implement new things periodically. But when I was doing a lot of that during the development of MuseScore 2, one of the tools that I developed was called the Explode tool, and then the Implode tool that went along with it. And it was designed so that you could take music. In fact, let me add some staves here. I'm going to need them soon enough anyhow. So I'm going to add a couple staves. If I select this measure, I've entered notes as a chord. In fact, let me just add some more notes to this now. I'm going to add another C, an E, I'll add a G, and an F. No, an F's going to sound terrible. I'll add a B and put it down in the middle, control down. All right, I wrote this as a series of 4 chords, but maybe I really want the notes distributed here. I want the top note on this staff, this note on this staff, because this, maybe I'm writing, for, say, a clarinet ensemble or something. So I wrote a tool that would take that and split it up, explode. And now the notes are split up among the staves. This is bass clef, that's why it's so many ledger lines up. It's a very useful tool when arranging. And an occasionally useful tool is to do the reverse. Edit, Tools, Implode, and it recombines those notes into chords. When I wrote the tool, it was really only meant for this situation where you are writing music for an ensemble. You have the identical rhythms in all parts, just different pitches. It's pretty common when writing for like a trumpet section in a jazz big band, or writing for the 2 flutes in an orchestra or whatever. It's pretty common to write this way. So these tools are very useful, but my tool didn't handle multiple voices at all, because that really wasn't part of my thinking in writing that tool. Well, someone else came along and said, you know what, it would be really great. And man, I would love it if I could remember who did that. Did Yo-Yo do that? I don't remember. someone took the idea of this tool and said, hey, it would be really great if we could enhance this implode tool to actually do something that would be useful when writing in multiple voices. And they took my tool and made this change. So look at what's going to happen. I've written this measure in 2 voices. If I go to Edit, Tools, Implode, boom, right there it does in one fell swoop pretty much everything that I did here by hiding those rests. It actually deleted them, and then it moved that note into this, it moved this note from voice 2 to voice 1. In other words, it combined notes where it could, deleted rests where it could, left the notes in independent voices where it had to. The only thing I would possibly need to do now is go in and manually fix the stem directions, because again, as soon as there's multiple voices, MuseScore is going to put everything in voice 1 stem up, everything in voice stem down, whereas for those beats where there's only one voice, probably you only want you want to have the stem directions do the kind of normal thing. So those are some of the things you can do with multiple voices in MuseScore. And I want to show one other useful example of this. Let me go, actually I'm just going to create a new score, just so you can see a little bit about this process. No, I'm just going to use this one, this is fine. I want to talk a little bit about like copying and pasting notes between voices. So let's say I've decided I want to separate out this into separate staves. Let me get rid of this bass clef. Actually, I'm just going to move it down. I can do that. I can take that staff and move it down. And I can take this staff. So I'm basically turning this into a soprano, alto, tenor, bass type of score. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to change this to the tenor thing. I do this so seldom. It's this guy, right? That's the guy that's going to make middle C be up here? Yep, okay. So what if I've originally written the thing thinking it was going to be for soprano, alto, tenor, bass, the way I originally had it with only 2 staves. But now I've decided, really I want to separate it all out onto 4 staves. I could really use some variation of explode that did the right thing with multiple voices. But unfortunately, the explode command does not do that. It just wasn't designed for that. And there's a lot of complications that would come up, and I'm sure it's a solvable problem. It's just no one has decided to tackle it. But there is a way to get these notes here onto that staff. And I kind of want to walk through that process. It's going to use the selection filter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, but I'm not going to select the whole measure. I'm going to exclude voice 1 from the selection here. The selection filter, by the way, view selection filter. That's what enabled it. So if I hit that again, it will disable it. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay, there we go. And the shortcut is F6. So F6 displays it and hides it. So by unchecking voice 1 is no longer included in my selection. Only voice 2 is selected. And now I can copy it. Now I can come here and paste it. Now I know full well as soon as I click this, nothing's going to happen. Why? Because voice 1 is excluded in my voice filter. I need to re-include it, otherwise I can't select anything. So I come here, and now I've selected this measure, and now I can paste, and it is pasted voice 2. So at this point, I almost have what I want, but really I don't want this in voice 2. I want it in voice 1. Now there's the clever way and the cleverer way to do that. Here's the clever way to do it. Well, one clever way to do it, there's multiple clever ways. One is to exchange voice 1 and 2. So that was edit, voices, exchange voice 1 and 2. And when I do that, it just leaves my rest over here in, because remember before, let me undo that. When I pasted, it pasted these notes into voice 2, but it left my rest in voice 1. So when I did the voice exchange, that voice that was in voice 1 has now moved to voice 2, but I can safely delete that voice. So that's one way of getting the job done. But as usual in MuseScore, there's multiple ways of doing things. So let me paste again. How about this time if I say, hey, let's just move those notes to voice 1. That'll work. So that worked. But now that left me with individual rests to have to delete here. So that wasn't necessarily an improvement. But here's going to be the cleverest method still, if it works, and I think it will. What if I use implode? I would like to think that implode is just going to do everything for me, including getting rid of the rest. I think that's going to work. Oh, wow, look at that. It totally did not. Wow, what happened to that A? Wow. Okay, so implode, I want to see if that had something to do with all the pasting and undoing and everything I did. I just want to enter that measure from scratch. I'm going to switch to here, to voice 2, and say A and G. Oops, let me do it as half notes. A, G. Select this and say implode. All right, so that did not in fact work, which is kind of a drag. I was hoping it would. I do suspect that if I change this to an actual whole rest, here's another little thing to be aware of. Notice these rests, they're what we colloquially call whole rest, but they're a little different. A whole rest is 4 beats. But this is what's called a full measure rest. It takes up a whole measure, regardless of the time signature. So even in 2/4 time, an empty measure gets this kind of rest, or in 3/4, an empty measure gets this kind of rest. It's called a full measure rest. It looks just like a whole rest, but it's centered in the measure. If I take this and press 7, it'll turn it into an actual whole rest. Wow, maybe I have to actually enter the thing. All right, I'm going to enter it. 7, 0. Now I have a whole rest. Okay. So this is now a whole rest. It's actually entered at the beginning of the measure. The only time you would normally do this is if you were in a time signature of like 6/4 and you needed to show the first 4 beats were empty. But I want to see if maybe the full measure rest is what was confusing the implode, and if this will go a little better. It might not, but you know, I'm learning along with you guys because again, as I mentioned, I didn't write that part of the code. Nope, that didn't work any better. So anyhow, the implode tool will apparently not do good things if there's a rest in voice 1. It's sort of assuming that voice 1 has some notes already, and now you're adding things to it. So there you go. So what I thought was going to be the cleverest solution is actually the worst solution because it doesn't work. So the correct way to get this done, a test of the emergency alert system. There you go. I haven't had one of those interrupt my Café before. Lovely. So the best approach then was edit voices, exchange voice 1 and 2, and then delete that. So that is how you can basically split this measure up. But notice now these notes are still there. I would have to delete them. Well, again, I can do that by selecting that measure again, excluding voice 1 from the selection, and now pressing delete. And now those notes are gone. So, and then re-enable voice 1. So that is how you can basically manually explode things. I use the selection filter to only copy the voice I wanted, and then I also use the selection filter to only delete the voice I wanted. Undoing things a few more times, I could actually have done this a little differently. I could have just copied the whole thing down here, and then gone here and deleted voice 1, or deleted voice 2 by excluding voice 1, and then come here and delete voice 1. Oops, what did I do? I did the wrong thing. I wanted to delete voice 1, so I'm going to exclude voice 2 from the selection. And so you'll see undo is my friend. I make mistakes a lot, but undo bails me out all the time. So now by excluding voice 2 from the selection, when I press delete, it's going to remove voice 1, leaving me with voice 2. And then I can do the voice exchange, etc. So, you know, there's lots of different manipulations that you can do in MuseScore when working with multiple voices. So thanks for being with me and watching as I do this. If you have any further questions, I'm still around. Feel free to participate in the chat here, and I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I would want to cover that I didn't. I guess one thing I should mention is I had mentioned an aversion to these sort of holes. In other words, the fact that there's nothing on beat 2. And in order to demonstrate my aversion a little better, let me go back to voice 1, I'm going to enter a quarter note. And then I'm going to delete this rest only. Now there's a hole here on beat 2. What I think you'll find is you can't actually enter anything there. If I type an F, if I try to move the cursor there, it just skips right over that hole. The only way past that is to either lengthen this note. I could press W to lengthen that note, and that turned it into a half note. But another trick to fix these holes would be to just do a voice exchange twice. So if I do exchange voices 1 and 2, it creates the rests that are needed, because voice 1 is not allowed to have holes. So it created that rest for me, and then I can do the voice exchange back. And now my holes are gone, and now I've got these rests back that I can press V to hide. I don't like the holes because they create those editing issues, but I know a lot of people don't like seeing grayed out rests. And by the way, you can make grayed out things disappear. View, show invisible. And now those grayed out things disappear. But boys, I like to be able to see the grayed out things because I might want to select them and do things with them later. So I would just as soon keep them around, and it just doesn't bother me. I know they're not going to show up in the PDF. I know they're not going to show up when I print. But if it bothers you, then by all means, you can go to View and turn off the display of invisible things, or you can delete those rests as long as you are willing to live with the fact that it creates these holes that can be hard to edit later. Notice everything I've done has only involved 2 voices. Most things in music only need 2 voices. 3 voices can come into play. I guess I'll show an example of that by loading in a score that's going to look familiar to some old-timers with MuseScore, and that's Reunion, the song I wrote to be a demo for MuseScore 1.2, I think was where it was written for. Reunion uses multiple voices pretty heavily. There's 2 voices through here. Oh, and this is a spot where notice, getting back to that original question, the first measure showed multiple voices that kind of needed to be that way because the rhythms were different. This measure, the rhythms were the same. I could have combined those into one voice, but I didn't because there was enough going on that was just polyphonic enough in the other measures that it seemed a little easier to me. Plus, I frankly wanted to show off the multiple voices feature of MuseScore. That was part of the purpose in writing Reunion. The entire purpose actually was to show off features. So I wanted to show off multiple voices. So that's part of why I did that also. But this measure could have been combined with implode. Actually, the implode feature didn't exist at the time, but now that it does, I can safely implode that measure and it will do the same thing. In fact, if you haven't heard the piece in a while. Oh, by the way, can you hear me and the music? I've been getting complaints that you couldn't hear me over the music because the way it was working, but I think I've figured out how to change my settings. So I'm using multiple voices throughout here, and mostly there's 1 voice in the bottom staff, 2 voices at most on top. But there's this one spot over here where I actually needed 3 voices in the top staff. So I'm going to go back there in a second. There you go. Little blast from the past for you and for me. So this measure here, I had a sustained note and then another sustained note here that realistically is when I play this, I believe I play it. Do I play it? I'm looking at my hands and the music to see. I do play that B with my right thumb. So, yeah, I'm sure you can't see my hands, but oh well. I am playing this with my right thumb because my hand's not big enough to make that reach conveniently. I could probably force the issue, but it's much easier to do what I did, which is play this with my right thumb. So I'm showing this note coming in on beat 2 as a half note, but meanwhile this note's sustaining, and meanwhile I've got these quarter notes. Well, that's just one too many voices to do with 2 voices, so I need 3 voices. So this is the note I entered first. It's kind of the main melody note. It's the highest note, so I put it in the top voice. This moving line here was the next most important thing, and I wanted to show it with stems down and in voice 2. But this note here, because it's the lowest note, I figure also needed to have stems down, but it's a different rhythm than this, so I entered this into voice 4. Voice 4, like voice 2, is stems down by default. Now, when you do that, if I press Control R, that resets the position, you'll see that by default, it actually shows up aligned. Occasionally, depending on what you're using multiple voices for, that might be what you want. But in this case, it wasn't. I really wanted to show this a little more distinctly. So what I did, well, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. You can either double-click the note and then use the arrow keys to move over a little bit, and then hit escape and the stem will follow. You can do that, or you can press F8 or go to the View menu to enable the inspector, which I never do. I use F8. That's why I can't find it on the menu, inspector. So with this selected, I can then go to the chord section of the inspector and change the horizontal offset to move it over, half a space or so. Oh, good. Thanks for the comment about the balance of voice and music. Yeah, so that's what I was shooting for. So here I've needed 3 voices to do what I was doing here, and that's how I did it. I entered the 3rd voice, and then I just manually moved the note over a little bit to get that to do what I wanted it to do. I'm trying to think. I've been using MuseScore since I think 2011, and so that's like 7.5 years, and I've written a lot of music in MuseScore. I mean, a lot of music, just tons and tons of lead sheets, tons of arrangements for small jazz ensembles, for string quartets, solo piano music like this, choir music, orchestra. I've written all sorts of pieces, and I am trying to think of if I've ever needed 4 voices, and I'm not sure I ever have, to be honest. So 4 voices, if it ever comes up, great, you've got it. A 5th voice will virtually never happen, no matter how much music you ever write. The idea of using a 3rd voice where occasionally necessary, yeah, that's great that it's there, but some people make the mistake of thinking they're going to use voice 3 when writing a choir arrangement. They think, oh, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, voice 1, 2, 3, 4, but don't do that. It's always start with voice 1. So voice 1 and 2 on the top staff, and then voice 1 and 2 on this staff. Each staff gets up to 4 voices. So at a couple different points, I've mentioned some, I'll talk about this later. I don't remember if I've talked about them all later. One of the things I know I haven't mentioned, but I'll just give you a heads up about it. I had mentioned that there's a utility that I've been using that displays my keystrokes as I type them. I'm doing this because I've been recording a whole series of tutorial videos. Some of them are from my site, MasteringMuseScore.com. And if you haven't been to my site, here's a slight commercial for my site, MasteringMuseScore.com. And my site, MasteringMuseScore.com, goes along with my book, So, certainly if you have a copy of the book, there's additional information for you here. If not, you will have ample opportunity to buy the book from here. But there's all sorts of tutorials, long and short. The quick answers are some of the short ones that are useful to know. I guarantee they are quick even if my internet connection is not, and my computer is not being quick. As I've apologized for in the past, while I'm broadcasting video, my computer slows to a crawl. So here we go. The quick answers are these really short to the point things about how to do specific things. And here's the one on entering multiple voices, since that's today's topic. And when I click it, what you'll see is, well, first of all, one thing I like about these quick answers is I included just these little thumbnails, so even if you don't know what to call them, then you can say, oh, that's what I want to do, and look it up. And what they are is they're just really short descriptions of how to do something, just a couple of paragraphs, maybe a bullet list, step by step. But then there's a demo. And the demo is meant to be just as straightforward as possible to show you how to do things. And so you can see me clicking up here. What you can't see is if I type something here, you can't tell what I'm typing. So I've been using software that now can display my keystrokes as I type when I'm recording these tutorials. So there's going to be additional tutorials on Mastering MuseScore. The really exciting thing I'm working on right now is a full online course, and this is going to be super in-depth. It's going to basically be virtually everything in my book, which is like a 400-page book, presented in video format. So stay tuned. I've started uploading video for that. And if you go to the home page of my site, you'll see there was a link to tell you where you can pre-enroll. I've started uploading the video as of the last few days. Over the next couple weeks, I'll be uploading the rest. And so if you click here, it'll take you to the complete online course. And there's going to be several hours worth of video. I don't know exactly how many it's going to add up to, but I'm guessing it's going to be on the order of 4 hours worth of video. So it's going to be very in-depth, but it's not like one long 4-hour video. I wouldn't put you through that. It's going to be divided up into little sections following the same basic structure as the book. So individual little 4-minute lessons or whatever. So it's a pretty exciting thing that will be launching very soon, and I hope will really help a lot of people get the most out of MuseScore. So I feel like I've been talking long enough, and I don't see any further questions. So I think I will leave it at that and leave you till next week. I can tell you some of the topics that I have in mind to talk about coming up. One is the Google Summer of Code, which just completed. We had students working on MuseScore that Google sponsors students to work on open source software. So we had some students participating in that, and I'd love to be able to show off some of their work. Accessibility work was work done in Google Summer of Code last year and a few years ago, and some of that code is just starting to come online now. So I want to show off some of the Google Summer of Code projects from this year, but I also want to do a separate session talking about accessibility, because that's some stuff that was done in the past that's only going to just start to show up in MuseScore in the next version. By accessibility, I mean making MuseScore more usable for the visually impaired, making it more, and in particular, it's going to mean more keyboard focus, which will also benefit all of us. Keyboard shortcuts, for instance, for everything on the palette is hopefully going to be coming soon. Another topic I want to talk about is fugues. I'm sitting here in the studio at one of the teaching studios at Regis University where I teach, and one of the courses that I teach here is Counterpoint, in which I teach the writing of fugues. I want to talk a little bit about that process, because it's one of these really fascinating things that once you get the bug to write fugues, you start writing little bits of fugues all over the place. And in fact, I'm just going to switch back to MuseScore and put on my fugue and start it playing as I sign out. But I want to talk about fugues. There's yeah, there's lots of topics I can be talking about. So by all means, leave me comments with suggestions of topics for future cafes. But mostly, I'm just going to highlight whatever is interesting me at that particular moment, and hoping that at some point other people will be interested in that at that moment also. So with that, I think I'm just going to start playing this fugue and sign out. So hope you all have a great week. There you have it. That's a fugue in Baroque style that I wrote when I was taking a graduate counterpoint course several years ago, and that's when I kind of got the bug. And in some future cafe, I won't go through the entire composition process, but I'll talk a little bit about the idea of writing a fugue, because to me it's just a utterly fascinating thing. It fascinates me in the same way that programming fascinates me, or improvisation fascinates me. So that's just how my mind works, I guess. So anyhow, and in case you're wondering, yeah, I can kind of play that on the piano, but not very well. It's a little, it's a bit difficult for me. So anyhow, with that, I think I will sign off and see you next week.